Ik ben Erik van der Vlist en dit is dossier THC.
Yeah, hold on, that's on the road. Just be cool, yeah?
Drugs have an involuntary effect on the eyes that you can't control. The police can spot this.
Ik zeg hier dat je wel gebruikt hebt. En ik zeg ook dat het nog niet zo lang geleden is. Kun je namelijk prima aan de stand van je ogen zien. Als ik namelijk met een lamp op je ogen schijn, kijk mij aan, dan zie ik dat jouw pupillen die worden niet kleiner. En als jouw pupillen niet kleiner worden, dan heb jij recent nog gebruikt. Dus we kunnen ook voor een bloedtest gaan, vind ik prima, maakt mij allemaal niet uit. Dan laat ik de dokter erbij komen, laat ik bloed trekken en dan zal die uitmaken of jij THC in je lijf hebt. Ik zeg hier dat je het hebt. Ja, daar gaan we voor.
Ja, dat is goed dan. Ik heb vanmiddag.
Kijk, nou komen we er. Nou komen we er. Dus het kan wel. Moet je niet doen, jongen. Moet je niet doen bij je gedragsdeskundige. Moet je niet doen. Die pluk jou eruit. Ja? Goed. Zijn we tenminste na lang aandringen, zijn we in ieder geval eerlijk naar elkaar. Ja, en dan ga ik dus nu, jou een ontzegging geven voor een aantal uren. Dan kom je er heel genadig vanaf. Ja? Op deze manier gaan we het doen.
This test can only help you. That is a lie. The test absolutely can and will hurt you. If you take any tests on the side of the road in a DUI investigation, those tests can and will be used against you in court to determine if the officer has probable cause to arrest you for DUI. So a lot of times the officers will say, oh, this handheld test can only help you if you take it. It's just between you and me. It doesn't go to court. Those are all lies along the same lines. Basically, they're trying to convince you to take the test that they know full well they will use in court to try to prove that they had a good reason to arrest you.
I'm an actor in an ad that was given 12 seconds to remind you that if you're high, just don't drive. Because if you feel different, you drive different. It's illegal to drive high everywhere anyway.
First things first, cannabis is a plant genus. That's genus, not genius, and it means that there's more than one of those. Hemp, for example, is a type of cannabis plant that you can make t-shirts of. But today we're not interested in t-shirts, we're interested in chemistry. Cannabis contains two chemical substances of interest. That's tetrahydrocannabinol, THC for short, and cannabidiol, CBD for short. THC is the main psychoactive compound of cannabis. It affects perception, cognition, and behavior and is responsible for the high. CBD is believed to have medical uses. We'll talk more about that later. Cannabis with a low concentration of THC is legal in most countries, though the limits differ somewhat from one place to the next. Hemp, for example, is low in THC, so your t-shirt is probably legal and there's little use in trying to smoke it. Cannabis plants are dioecious, which means male and female plants are different. The highest THC concentration is in the dried flowers of the female plant, so breeders will usually weed out the male ones regardless of their chosen pronouns. Marijuana refers to the dried flowers, leaves, stems and seeds of the cannabis plant. The stuff can be smoked, vaporized or used to make edibles. Usually that's something sweet to mask the taste, like cookies, gummies or candy. Hashish or hash is a concentrated form of marijuana that's made from certain parts of the cannabis plant. Making hash is rather labor-intensive, which is why it's usually more expensive than marijuana.
New insights into one of the most medically useful effects of cannabis. Cannabis is being prescribed more and more as a medical treatment, often as an appetite stimulant. When ingested, it can induce an almost insatiable urge to eat, which can be helpful for people with suppressed appetites, like cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy or patients with HIV or disorders of the nervous system. How exactly the drug creates this effect has been unclear, but according to new research, cannabis seems to stimulate the appetite by basically confusing the heck out of the brain's food center in the hypothalamus. Scientists from Yale University reported this week that the sudden hunger caused by cannabis is actually driven by neurons that are normally responsible for suppressing appetite. See, many of your brain cells are covered in receptors that allow them to communicate with each other by chemical signals called neurotransmitters. And some of these neurotransmitters are cannabinoids, chemicals that when accepted by your neurons can inhibit the release of other neurotransmitters. The active ingredient in cannabis, known as THC, basically imitates a cannabinoid and binds to its receptors, interfering with with the normal functions of neurons.
Now, calling them cannabinoid receptors is kind of misleading. It makes it sound like they're designed to be stimulated by cannabis. They're not. They're receptors located on neurons, and they're activated by chemicals called neurotransmitters, which basically allow neurons to communicate with each other. Cannabinoid receptors are found in all different parts of the brain. Their highest density occurs in the areas of the brain responsible for pleasure, thinking, memory, coordination, time perception. Normally, these cannabinoid receptors are not activated by cannabis. They're activated by a chemical called anandamide. And that neurotransmitter plays a large role in making short-term connections between nerve cells. It's also largely responsible for the brain's ability to forget things, which is very useful in our normal daily lives. We can't remember everything. And it seems to have a hand in regulating our eating behavior, as well as generating sensations of pleasure. Its name, anandamide, which is kind of a beautiful word, comes from the Sanskrit word for inner bliss. Anandamide, for what it's worth, has been found in chocolate. Anandamide and THC belong to the same class of chemicals, which we call cannabinoids. By mimicking anandamide and binding to and activating those receptors, THC interferes with the normal functioning of your brain. Well, your brain is now on drugs.
7768 traffic.
The car pulled to the side momentarily, then suddenly started backing up quickly, hitting their squad car and other vehicles.
Stay by.
If you're Googling how to tell if you're too high, you're too high. If you're eating nachos and you can't tell how long you've been putting sour cream on one particular chip, you're too high. If you're eating nachos, you're too high. If you're thinking about how crazy it is that your heart just beats on its own, but now that you're thinking about it, you can't stop, and you're convinced that if you do stop thinking about it, your heart will stop, you're too high. If you're wondering if the effects are permanent and you'll never go back to being not high, you're too high. If you're texting your mom out of the blue to ask if you've been a bad daughter, you're too high. If you think you're on the same wavelength as your cat, you're too high. If you're trying to watch a movie but can't pick one, so you go on the internet, but then you don't know which site to use, so you Google what's the best movie review site, and now it's 2 hours later and you have to go to bed because you work in the morning but you can't sleep, you're too high.
Marijuana acts on the body's cannabinoid system, which has receptors all over the brain and body. Molecules native to the body, called endocannabinoids, also act on these receptors. We don't totally understand the cannabinoid system, but it has one feature that provides a big clue to its function. Most neurotransmitters travel from one neuron to the next through a synapse to propagate a message. But endocannabinoids travel in the opposite direction. When a message passes from the one neuron to the next, the receiving neuron releases endocannabinoids. Those endocannabinoids travel backward to influence the sending neuron, essentially giving it feedback from the receiving neuron. This leads scientists to believe that the endocannabinoid system serves primarily to modulate other kinds of signals, amplifying some and diminishing others. Feedback from endocannabinoids slows down rates of neural signaling. That doesn't necessarily mean it slows down behavior or perception, though. For example, slowing down a signal that inhibits smell could actually make smells more intense. THC is thought to be primarily responsible for marijuana's psychoactive effects on behavior, cognition, and perception, while CBD is responsible for the non-psychoactive effects. Like endocannabinoids, THC slows down signaling by binding to cannabinoid receptors. But it binds to receptors all over this sprawling, diffuse system at once, whereas endocannabinoids are released in a specific place in response to a specific stimulus. This widespread activity, coupled with the fact that the cannabinoid system indirectly affects many other systems, means that each person's particular brain chemistry, genetics, and previous life experience largely determine how they experience the drug.
Endocannabinoids are molecules that closely resemble the main chemical in the cannabis plant, delta-9-tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. Because THC is so similar to the brain's own endocannabinoids, such as anandamide or 2-AG, smoking marijuana directly affects the brain of the user. When someone smokes marijuana, THC molecules quickly reach the brain. There, THC competes with the brain's endocannabinoids to bind with cannabinoid receptors on neurons that regulate dopamine activity. Among other effects, THC reduces the release of GABA in the striatum. This reduction, in turn, causes nearby dopamine neurons to release more dopamine. Increased dopamine release produces the positive feelings or the marijuana high.
First thing to note is that because THC is a lipid-soluble, overweight individuals will retain THC in their system for longer than their thinner companions. Worse still, if you smoke cannabis, don't go for heavy exercise just prior to any urine test, as when fat is broken down, THC is released into your system and will come out in your urine. However, before you think that going for a run might also get you stoned on that THC, the levels are detectable but minuscule and have no psychotropic effect. Tests for THC are actually for the metabolite THC-COOH or tetrahydrocannabinol carboxylic acid, though that's a bit of a mouthful. You should also be aware that THC can build up in your system over time, so regular users are more likely to retain THC in their system for longer than newbies, who have a relatively pristine metabolism. Light use would be up to 3 times a week, medium use would be up to 5 times a week, and heavy use would be 7 times a week, and chronic heavy use would be frequently every day. For a urine test, and as a rule of thumb, light users should see traces of THC disappear after 3 days, but heavy users will need up to 30 days plus. If you have to undergo a saliva test, then allow 3 days if you are a light user, 7 days for a medium user, and 15 days for a heavy user, but again up to 30 days or even more if you are a chronic heavy user. For a blood test, the rule is up to 2 days for it to remain in the bloodstream, but THC has been found in blood tests 25 days after smoking cannabis, so unfortunately there is no definitive answer.
Starting this weekend through Labor Day, data shows it's the deadliest time on Minnesota roads, and the state's Safety Council president says this year it's going to get a lot harder to keep you safe.
There's no question. I mean, we're adding another legal substance to the list that can impair you.
When the governor signs recreational marijuana into law, there'll be no clear way to tell when a driver is too drugged to drive, in part because THC dissolves in fat and alcohol in water, meaning the two are absorbed very differently, rendering the 0.08 limit to measure booze useless in the case of cannabis.
Alcohol in humans works in a way that you can actually find a number. It doesn't work that way for any other drug.
What's trickier is the drug can leave the blood system quickly. Levels vary whether you eat or smoke it, and daily users build up so much THC but aren't always high.
That's where everything gets really complicated.
The question they ask most is about driving.
What do people ask?
If they're pulled over by the drug bus, would they be charged if they've got cannabis in their system? And the answer is yes, because it's only about presence, not impairment.
So what have we gleaned from all of this? What's the ultimate bottom line? Well, stoned driving isn't safe. But if you look at the odds of having an accident after being stoned, they're about double. And if you look at the odds of driving when you're intoxicated on alcohol, they're about 10 times that of driving sober. And roadside testing needs to be specifically adapted to cope with marijuana-impaired drivers. The other thing that I've tried to convince you of is just based on the persistence of THC in the blood over weeks, or up to weeks. Per se laws, to me, seem completely arbitrary and with no scientific foundation. They really should be done away with. One thing that I might encourage you to do, if you feel like doing something about this, is to write to your local legislator and just urge for stoned driving laws to be based on science rather than based on arbitrary and capricious laws, not based on science as they are at the moment.
Dat was hem even. Abonneer je vooral op dit kanaal, like deze video en deel hem vooral. Meer informatie vind je terug op zowel in de folder als op de website van Cannabis en Verkeer. De folder vind je in de koffieshop bij jou in de buurt. Stichting VOC is volledig afhankelijk van donateurs. Als jij deze zaak steunt, word daarom ook patron van Stichting VOC. De link vind je hieronder. Je vindt dus ook op Patreon natuurlijk. En doe dat vooral. En dan nog even dit. We doen een oproep aan jou. Als jou dit ook is overkomen. Ben jij slachtoffer van de speekseltest? Laat het ons weten. Vertel ons wat je is gebeurd, waar het is gebeurd en welke impact het achteraf op jou had. We zijn erg benieuwd naar jouw verhaal. En als je bereid bent om jezelf te laten zien, stuur een video in van jezelf. Dankjewel. Tot de volgende.